Okay, this is the mini lecture on 1st and 2nd Kings, and I just want to show you in the syllabus the reason I do this just the way, not to confuse students, but just to reiterate the fact that there'll be some overlap in the topics that we're covering for this coming week and the week after, just because I'm not exactly sure where I'll stop and where I'll end from a week to week, but but we'll stay close to the syllabus and cover all of this material by the end of the week of November 11th. We'll be through Chronicles and perhaps even a little ahead on Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So this is where we're going, and just as a way of reminder, every theological journal, High Point entry that you create, every time you press the button Create Journal, you will be only putting in one biblical book, all right, based on where we are in the according to the syllabus. So yes, you will be breaking up 1st and 2nd Samuel into two separate entries, 1st and 2nd Kings into two separate entries, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles into two separate entries. So the combination of all of these, if you do the math, you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 journal entries for what we're covering this week and next week as well. Hopefully that's as clear as I can make it. So as we get to Kings, one of the things that we know, if you can see in the more detailed notes here in PowerPoint, some of the things that I'm focusing on is how to evaluate theologically this historical period, this 400-year period. Almost like what we have here is an entire another book of Judges period, 400 years. However, without kings and judges, now we have kings. And that's the question that the author of Judges left us with, is what if a king comes on the situation, will the situation change? And the answer to that question, well, it kind of changes, but it doesn't really fully solve the problem of the syncretism that continues to creep in and suck the life and vitality, covenant vitality out of the lives of the people, the nation. You're always going to have a faithful remnant around, and sometimes they show up and you see evidence of them, but largely in this period, this historical period, the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, largely the focus is going to be on the evaluation of the kings and the spiritual problems that are kind of still unsolved during this 400-year period. Of course, this whole period has been already, you might say, the framework for it, the evaluative framework has already been left for us in the words of Moses. Of course, don't forget Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20. We have the prescriptions for the kind of king that we're waiting for. We saw in Saul how that was a false start, and then we have the wholehearted King David, and then somewhat the half-hearted king in King Solomon. We saw that last week. So we've got now a divided kingdom that we're going to be looking at. Well, we're going to look at Solomon first and then the divided kingdom. So what we're going to have here and where this is going to go, again, has been mapped out by Moses. We have the two-sided coin of covenant relationship. He's the one that laid out the fork in the road. And if Israel as a nation turns to the left in terms of covenant infidelity, bringing in the pagan influence, then God is obligated to treat Israel just like he treated the pagan nations that were in the Promised Land before the conquest of Joshua. He'll drive them out and exile them, drive them out from the nation. It seems as if God's sights are set on the Promised Land in terms of a place for the establishment of his name, which means his reputation, according to Deuteronomy 12, which Moses left us with. But if there's an exile, Moses had already mapped out the plan for God to allow his people to repent, and if they do, he'll bring them back and restore them to the nation. And we have that mapped out in Deuteronomy chapter 30. So where we're going, the significant events that are just around the corner, we're going to have the fall of Israel. By the end of 2 Kings, we're going to see in 722 BC, and then finally the Babylonians will rise in power and take out and conquer Jerusalem or Judah in the south in 587-86 BC. Now what's interesting, through this whole period you've got kings that are evaluated, lots of them. 39 kings in total, 19 in the north, 20 in the south, and of those 19 kings that are evaluated in Israel in the north, 0 have a positive evaluation. And then we only have 8 kings, if you do the math, that are evaluated positively in Judah in the south. So we really have a mixed bag, and it really, I mean, if you look broad stroke, we saw that God or Yahweh is to be Israel's king through the whole thing. So it's interesting, if you go full circle, I'll just give you a broad theological, would be called, somewhat of a mega motif, you might say, is the crisis over Yahweh as king. When is that going to be solved? If it was introduced to us as the theological high point of Genesis 1 and 2, Yahweh ruling as king, when is that going to be the case again in Israel? And we'll see that when we get to the prophets in the spring, that the prophetic voice will begin to paint the picture of the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant that we saw last week, 2 Samuel 7, that starts to unpack this idea that there's going to be another king through David's line, through David's seed, who's going to be like King David in bringing about restoration and the fullness and all of the things with regards to bringing the exiles home and establishing peace and rule in the promised land. Well, what king is that going to be? Well, it's going to be God himself. That's going to be the king who comes in the fulfillment of that. He's going to be the ultimate problem solver with regards to all of these problems. So, of course, the prophetic voice is active during this whole 400-year period that we'll see. So when we get to Solomon here in chapter 3, we see some things that start to show up for King Solomon, that he's going to be a true half-hearted king. Half of his heart is full, half of his heart is empty. And here he is. He's building let's see here. You see here in chapter 3, verse 3, the author begins to give us an evaluation. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father. Chapter 3, verse 3, David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So this is part of the half heart that's showing up in King Solomon. But then in chapter 3, verses 10 through 14, we see that Solomon requests wisdom as a gift from the Lord, and the Lord grants that request. So in the early days of King Solomon, we see his gift of wisdom showing up. He's going to hire the best craftsmen for the building of the temple. In chapter 6, the Ark of the Covenant will be brought back in its permanent home in chapter 8. And then in chapter 8, we have this full-length dedication of the temple, where Solomon really literally shows up and he recounts history and celebrates the magnificence of this moment, almost speaking like a Moses in getting his theology right with regards to the specialness of the day. And the glory of the Lord is going to fill the temple and commemorate this event. But I like this deep thought picture here. It's kind of captures the essence of Solomon in a lot of ways. And if you look at chapter 10, he's going to have a special visit from the Queen of Sheba. And there's a lot of things that come out of the author's emphasis here in the evaluation of King Solomon. First of all, the emphasis on gold. There in chapter 10, starting in verse 14, you read down from that point on, and you can see gold, 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 and more gold. And there in verse 26 in chapter 10, you have the emphasis on the gathering of horsemen and chariots. And, there he is building the largest army around. There in chapter 10, verses 23 and 24, you even have the idea that Solomon seems to be charging admission so that people on the outside visiting can see the magnificence of his splendor. There in chapter 11, verses 1 and through 3, you've got the evidence there for King Solomon. While he was really good at negotiation and diplomacy, but yet he's entering into all these covenant arrangements with neighboring pagan nations. What happens in the ancient world is there's an exchange of women. These pagan women are being brought into Solomon's kind of group of women, and it is literally eating him on the inside out with regards to the pagan influence. Not only that, he's allowing this pagan influence to creep over and overlap into his kingdom. So had Moses shown up on the scene and evaluated King Solomon, well, actually he does. Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20. Don't accumulate military might. Don't accumulate gold. Don't accumulate women. You're supposed to read the Torah, learn it, live it, and be a walking billboard of covenant relationship for your people. But is that what King Solomon is doing? Well, great. He's applying wisdom to be a great political leader and successful at building the kingdom, but whose kingdom is he supposed to be building? What about the spiritual kingdom? What about helping model covenant relationship to his kingdom? And that's not happening in Solomon's early years. However, I don't want to leave Solomon totally off the page of exhibiting a whole heart to God, or at least half the heart that he had. Because one of the things that King Solomon does, and we'll get to this in the spring, I'll reiterate this, but like King David, being that King David was a songwriter, Solomon was one who contributed theological truth to his kingdom through the writing and collecting of those proverbs. So he's writing wisdom sayings, those short, pithy sayings that make up our collection of proverbs in the book of Proverbs. So that's his book. That's his magnum opus. He leaves that with his kingdom as a theological way of communicating truth and covenant truth with God, before God. He's also writing two other books. He's writing Ecclesiastes, and I would argue that's a book that he wrote near the end of his life, but looking back on a life where he had really put the emphasis in a lot of the wrong places, and it's all about the vanity and the emptiness of some of the pursuits that he was about as king. But you get to the end of Ecclesiastes, you get to the punchline, theological punchline. It's about fearing the Lord and walking in obedience before him. Solomon's leaving that book with his kingdom, looking back on his own life of regret, with a few regrets. And the other book that I think he's also writing, also looking back on his own life, having made a lot of mistakes, was in the area of relationships. Song of Songs, I would say, is not about King Solomon. It's not about his own special one true love out of all the women that he collected. No, I think he's writing about at least an ideal situation, or perhaps he's got a real couple in mind who, through the very beginning stages of courtship, dating, leading up to the marriage day, the wedding day, and then the consummation of marriage, wedding night, and then afterwards. But the whole thing is about the celebration of romance and what the celebration of a couple in love. So he's writing that book, I think, in somewhat of a regret, but looking back and leaving that book to his kingdom as a means of conveying theological truth and doing it the right way for his kingdom. So in 922, in chapter 12 of 1 Kings, there in verse 16, what's interesting, we have the divided kingdom. We have a divided kingdom that takes place. We've got Rehoboam, who's the son of Solomon after Solomon's death, being king and set as king for Israel. But then you've got Jeroboam is going to be established as the king for the northern tribes when all Israel saw. So they're making him king. And the north, you've got a divided kingdom. Rehoboam over the southern two tribes, and Jeroboam the first as king over the northern 10 tribes. But notice in verse 25 there in chapter 12, Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim. He lived there, and he went out from there and built Penuel. Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will return to the house of David. So what's interesting is what Jeroboam does in instituting really what I would almost call a counterfeit religion, even more it's not just syncretistic, but it's really a counterfeit. He says if this people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem, then their heart of this people will return to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So this is a spiritually and politically motivated decision. So he consults, he makes 2 golden calves. He sets one in Bethel and one in Dan, the northern and southern borders of his nation, his new kingdom. And that's where the people are going to go to worship. So they're back to worshiping golden calves again. It almost takes us back to Exodus 32 all over again. He also institutes counterfeit feasts. In verse 32, he instituted a feast in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, like the feast which is in Judah. And he went to the altar and thus did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves. So he's replacing the true worship of Yahweh with false worship, and he's making it convenient for his people so that they're not going to be persuaded otherwise if they go back to Jerusalem to worship in the temple that Solomon built. Just a couple slides here to show the divided kingdom and what it does with regards to what it looks like in the map. You've got Jerusalem as the capital city, and then Samaria as the capital city of Israel in the north, Jerusalem of Judah in the south. This slide here shows the actual temple that was built, and really in terms of size, not tremendously impressive. It wasn't really that big, but in terms of its ornateness. But really this is a temple that was designed to follow the design of the tabernacle before, and really reflects, I would call, any heavenly design, the temple that would reflect the true tabernacle or the true temple in heaven. So it's designed this way for a reason, in that it models and, might say, echoes the eternal reality where God dwells and where God rules. So when the people by faith go to this place and engage in the comprehensive sacrificial system, there's an intersection with an eternal reality of what's going on and what's true in that eternal, you might say, the eternal now reality. Of course, the Lamb that was slain from before the foundation of the world is going to be the same Lamb who is slain and offers real experience of forgiveness to the faithful, in many cases, at least by now, the faithful remnant who are in Israel, but still coming to the temple. But in the north, and from this point on, Jeroboam I has pretty much laid the foundation and allowed the cement to dry with regards to the worshiping of this false religion in Israel in the north. Back in Judah, we're going to have Rehoboam getting off to a rocky start. Rehoboam is evaluated in verse 21, and Judah, because of Rehoboam, did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy more than all that their fathers had done with the sins which they committed. They built high places in Asherim, and there were male cult prostitutes in the land. They did all according to all the abominations of which the nations which the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. So here already we're seeing the idolatry, the syncretism creeping in and starting to invade, literally, God's special prized treasure possession, his people, his nation. According to, right, Exodus 19, 1 through 5, I think verse 4 there calls him the special treasure, or segulah. Now it's having mud thrown all over it. So how's the Lord going to respond to this situation? But here's what we're going to see. We have Rehoboam's son Asa, and over in chapter 15, starting in verse 11, Asa did what was right in the sight of the Lord, like David his father. He also put away the male cult prostitutes in verse 12 from the land, removed all the idols which his father had made. He removed Maacah, his mother, from being queen mother, because she had made a horrid image as an Asherah, and Asa cut down the horrid image and burned it at the brook of Kidron. But this almost reform effort stops always at the high places. Verse 14. But the high places were not taken away. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly devoted to the Lord all of his days. So here's one of the other kings who's evaluated positively. There's only about 8 in Judah in the south. So what's happening in the north? Let's turn to the north. So that's one thing about kings, is it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. In the north, we've got the reference here in chapter 16 to King Omri. Now, his claim to fame, he's going to be a tremendously successful political king in the north in Israel. He's going to build the capital city here in chapter 16, beginning in verse 23. He bought the hill Samaria from Shemar for 2 talents of silver, and he built on the hill and named the city which he built Samaria, which will establish now as the capital city of the northern tribes called Israel. Omri is going to be recognized as a very successful political king in the ancient world. But theologically, we have the evaluation of the author here in verse 25. Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord. He acted more wickedly than all who were before him. He walked in all the way of Jeroboam. We always hiss when we hear Jeroboam the first mentioned, the son of Nevat, in his sins which he made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel with their idols. So he's spiritually not a good king, which is really according to the author of Kings, is the big theological idea, the most important thing, and that's in line with, of course, Moses in the words in Deuteronomy 17:14 through 20. Now, Omri's son Ahab, we're going to have show up here at the end of chapter 16. Ahab was the son of Omri. He did evil in the sight of Yahweh more than all who were before him, and it came about as you hear the irony screaming off the page here from the author, and it came about as though it had been a trivial thing, verse 31, to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he married Jezebel, don't name your kid Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went to serve Baal and worshipped him. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal. I call those International House of Baals, IHBs, kind of like an International House of Pancakes, or you could say International House of Paganism, IHOP. So he built in Samaria, and Ahab also made the Asherah. Thus Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel than all of the kings of Israel who were before him. So this is the situation that is really going on. This is a king-led idolatry, and it's like king, like nation, and that's what we have going on in this period in history. So the author's screaming off the page. So what does God begin to do in response? When the kings stop speaking for him, he raises up, I call them superheroes of the day, kind of like the Avengers. In chapter 18, of course, we've already met up with Elijah. He's the prophet, and here we have a standoff, the superheroes. Elijah takes on the 400 or 500 prophets of Baal, and here in chapter 18, beginning in verse 20, and he's going to call out these prophets of Baal, and there's going to be a sacrifice, and it's going to be about whose God is going to ignite the fires that will burn the sacrifice. Of course, Elijah says, you call, in verse 24, you call on the name of your God. Name means reputation. And I will call on the name or reputation of my God, Yahweh, and the God who answers by fire. He is God. And all the people answered and said, well, that's a good idea. So Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, choose one ox for yourselves, prepare it for the offering or the sacrifice. So what happens after that is he begins to mock them. Elijah mocks them in verse 27. After nothing happens, call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Either he's occupied, which means going to the bathroom, or gone aside, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and needs to be awakened, which is really going to get under the skin of these prophets because nothing is happening. So it's like King David on the battlefield with Goliath, getting his theology correct. You know, the name of the Lord is at stake, and it's that name or that reputation that needs to be elevated, and it's being demonstrated here as Elijah is trusting in the Lord to show up, and he does. So the emphaticness of this event is that he douses the sacrifice here, the campfire, with water, and then he prays to the Lord there in verse 36. O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I'm your servant, and that I've done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me this, that this people may know that you are God, you alone, you are the Lord, and that you have turned their heart back again. Then the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering. Not only that, all the water down to the dust. And all the people, when they saw it, in verse 39, Yahweh, he is God, Yahweh, he is God. Then Elijah said, it's time to do some house cleaning. Verse 40, go get the prophets of Baal, seize them and slay them there at the brook Kishon. So he begins the spiritual, a little house cleaning of himself. Now it's not directed by king, now it's directed by prophet. So after Elijah, and I've skipped over a couple things, you can look at it on your own, Elisha is raised up, and we have the ending of 1 Kings ending with an alliance between Ahab, who's the king of Israel, and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah in the south, and they're allying themselves against the Syrians. And in chapter 22, verse 41, we have chapter 22, verse 41, we've got the Jehoshaphat is evaluated, and he ends up being a pretty good king. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he became king, and he reigned 25 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Azuvah, and the daughter of Shilhi. And he walked in all the way of Asa his father. He did not turn aside from it, doing right in the sight of Yahweh. However, guess what was left? Just like I said before, the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burnt incense on the high places. So as we go and move into 2 Kings, which is really just a continuation in terms of reading of this whole historical period, we have some details and accounts of Elisha, who's taking over the prophetic ministry of Elijah. One of the things that's significant in 2 Kings chapter 9, Elisha is going to appoint Jehu as new king in Israel, who is parallel to, of course, Ahab, but he's going to be almost like a judge who's appointed, a judge. He's going to be appointed to bring judgment against the house of Ahab. And in 2 Kings chapter 9, we have some of the details. Jehu will be given instructions to render justice against the house of Ahab. He'll basically take out, according to chapter 9, verse 33 and following, killing the queen Jezebel, 70 sons of Ahab living in Jezreel, chapter 10. He's also going to kill the prophets of Baal. So this huge elimination of this stronghold of paganism that's rooted and well entrenched in the monarchy. So how does the author evaluate this northern king Jehu? Well, we kind of secretly would hope that there would be at least one good king evaluated positively in the north, but this is as close as we get. However, as for the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nevat, which he made Israel sin, from these Jehu did not depart, even the golden calves that were in Bethel and that were at Dan. Well, so there's a part of him that was faithful in terms of following through with carrying out the judgment of the Lord, but yet with regards to spiritual reform, King Jehu didn't have anything to do with it. Jehu was not careful to walk in the Torah of the Lord according to verse 31, the God of Israel, with all of his heart. And he did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel sin. So you can be a good king politically, but really fail miserably because of your spiritual commitments. And here's our deep thought picture. This is a good one because most everybody doesn't have the foggiest idea what's going on here. But you've got X with the palm trees and two kings on an isle. So you've got X isle, and the two kings are representing Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And it's exactly how the book of 2 Kings ends if you're looking for a spiritual high point. Both roads for both nations will lead to exile. So the remainder of Israel's history in the north we have in 2 Kings. We're going to have 4 of the descendants of Jehu, and every single account mentions the fact that these kings revert back to the sins of the house of Jeroboam. 5 kings later, and during the reign of Israel's king Pekah, we have the Assyrian exile that begins in 2 Kings 15:29. And the Assyrian king, during the king of Israel, King Pekah, in verse 29, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came and captured Ijon, Abel, Beth-Makkah, Janoah, Kadesh, Hatzor, Gilead, Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and he carried them captive to Israel. There's going to be 3, I call them the 3 big bullies on the block: Assyria, Babylonia, or the Babylonians, and then the Persians, Persia. The Assyrians, in terms of exilic policy, were the harshest. When they came and conquered you, they basically took you with them so that you would literally cease to exist as a nation. So you were deported and taken and assimilated, like the Borg of Star Trek, into another place and another culture, never to be seen again. And then they would deport some of their own people into the formerly occupied villages, and they would basically take over, and they would begin to establish themselves as a community. But they weren't Israelites. They were Assyrians. They were non-Israelites, and of course there'd be leftover Israelites still around, and then you'd have them mixed together with those. And that's the beginning points of the, if anybody ever wanted to know, the Samaritans that show up in history in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament context. You know, you've got this extreme hatred between Jews and Samaritans. Why? It's because historically the Samaritans are considered half-breeds. Bloodlines were lost because of this total annihilation, literally, of the Israelites in that part of the Promised Land. So the Assyrian exile that begins in Israel, we have a couple Assyrian kings later, Shalmaneser and Sargon. Sargon's the one that finishes the job with the siege of Samaria, the capital city, in 2 Kings 17, 5 through 6. In verse 6, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, captured Samaria and carried all Israel away into exile to Assyria and settled them in Halah and Havor on the river of Gozan and in the cities of the Medes. Interestingly, the author gives us another recount of the theological reason for Israel's exile. And you have the tough love measures of what Moses prescribed way back in Deuteronomy, there in chapter 28 and 29, with regards to what God would be committed to do, obligated to do, if Israel turns out looking more like the pagan nations that are formally driven out. That means that Israel will be driven out like a pagan nation from the Promised Land, and that's what happens because of their idolatry. And it's a long, detailed list, but you can read it on your own. And you can see in this map, it's a good one because it shows the Assyrian Empire is growing, and as it grows, it's got its sights on Egypt down here, but there in between, sandwiched in between, is still left over the remnant in Judah, which is just extremely small, and in a large measure, the Assyrians really don't have any reason to, other than a few filled treasury houses left over by the kings, but other than that, their big fish is Egypt. So we've got now the remainder of the focus is on 2 Kings, and two southern kings who, there's going to be a couple of kings during this time period that try to bring about necessary reform. Kind of a precarious situation like the picture here with regards to Hezekiah. On the one hand, according to 2 Kings 18, I'll let you look at that, he's going to bring about reform. He's going to clean house, and he's going to be the Deuteronomy 17 king that Israel needs. However, politically, there's going to be some struggle and somewhat of a crisis that also transpires. It's called the Sennacherib crisis, because Sennacherib is the name of the Assyrian king who comes down and takes out Israel and the capital city Samaria and starts to invade the northern border cities between Israel and Judah. And then as soon as those cities start to fall, that creates a crisis for Judah and the south. So you can read 2 Kings 18:13 through 23, and you've got the Assyrian, you might say, generals come down and start to taunt Hezekiah's God, Yahweh. He starts to taunt the name and the reputation of Yahweh. And it reminds me of the Battle of David and Goliath. And you know, we're waiting for King Hezekiah to show up with the right theology and to correct the situation and to speak out like David did. However, we don't get to that. What we get to, well, King Hezekiah prays in 2 Kings 19:14 through 19. But before that, in 2 Kings 19:1, guess who shows up? We have the prophet Isaiah. And there in verses 5 through 7 in chapter 19, Isaiah speaks in verse 6, "You shall say to your master, thus says the Lord, don't be afraid, because of the words that you've heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria has blasphemed me. Behold, I'll put a spirit in him, so he shall see a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword, by the means of his own land." And because of this prophetic encouragement, we see that in the prayer in verses 14 through 19, we've got now Hezekiah is starting to line up with the divine agenda. He's going to request and show a little boldness and trust in the Lord, that he's praying that this vision that he got from Isaiah would certainly become true. So God's going to confirm to King Hezekiah that indeed his prayer will be answered. And then we see the aftermath, the end of chapter 19, that it happened that night in verse 35, that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. Some kind of blight or plague immediately happened, and Sennacherib left, goes back to Nineveh, and it came about that Nisroch he was in the house of his gods, and then two individuals came and basically killed him. And then Esarhaddon becomes the next Assyrian king in his place. So the prophecy was fulfilled just like Isaiah had said it. Now, after Hezekiah, we have Manasseh, his son, taking place. And in 2 Kings 21, verses 1 through 9, we have the author screaming against Manasseh for the basic flip-flop that he does spiritually with regards to basically dismantling the reform efforts that his father Hezekiah had done. Two evil kings later, in the south, in Judah, we have King Josiah taking over. And according to chapter 22, verses 1 through 2, we have reform efforts that take place. And in a temple project, renovation project, in 2 Kings 22, verses 8 through 13, we have the king or somebody discovers a portion of the Old Testament law or the Torah. Probably some of Moses' very words out of Deuteronomy are read. Now, if you're a king hearing these words, you understand what's being said in the implications of why Judah now is being threatened from these exiles. And you read the words of Deuteronomy 28, and you understand why he rips his clothes and pulls out his hair and grieves and begins mourning, because he recognizes what's at stake. However, in 2 Kings 23, chapter 23, we have Josiah bringing back the reform efforts all the way to the covenant renewal, and then the covenant renewal ceremony. He's also going to, as a result of that, get the commitment and allegiance of the people, as well as driving out and cleaning house with regards to paganism. Unfortunately, after Josiah, a series of bad kings follow. And Babylon, as a nation, begins growing in power and sucking the life out of Judah. They begin a siege of Jerusalem, and they begin deporting their people. So there in 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 10 through 14, we have the reference to the deportation. And if you're interested in this, the first deportation, there's 3 waves or 3 phases of Jerusalem's fall. In 605 BC, the first deportation, I call it the Harvard grad deportation. You know, the brightest and the best and the elite were taken out of Jerusalem. Daniel and his friends, Rakshak and Benny, if you're a VeggieTales fan, go in that first wave. Then about 8 years later, 597 BC, the prophet Ezekiel goes with the people and becomes a significant voice for the people when they're in exile, such that 22,000 plus come back after the 70 years of being in Babylon. And then finally in 586 we have the fall of Jerusalem. And one prophet who's left behind, who chooses to stay behind with the poorest of the poor, is the prophet Jeremiah. And he's going to have a ministry with the group who've stayed behind. So in 2 Kings chapter 25, beginning in verse 8 and down through verse 12, we have the details of the destruction of Jerusalem. And this will be the end of, at least for a time, of the people of God in the Promised Land. But from what we've learned from Moses in Deuteronomy, that there's going to be a time of restoration after God's people repent. And guess what they're going to do? They're in Babylon under the preaching ministry and prophetic ministry of Ezekiel. He's going to be their pastor for 70 years. Maybe not quite that whole time, but because of his influence, there's going to be a spiritual revival take place. And, you know, there's going to be about 22,000 of these plus that come back under the leadership of Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, as we'll see, who begin the rebuilding project. And just to wrap up this little section on Kings, I want to spend a little time talking about just some interesting things for you future budding archaeologists out there. Some of the things that we have reference to with regards to, for example, 2 Kings 20:20, there's a reference to the tunnel, Hezekiah's tunnel, the Siloam, out to the pool of Siloam, or the spring, in anticipation of the Assyrian threat, that Sennacherib crisis that we talked about. King Hezekiah is going to do 2 things. He's going to reinforce the walls. They're pictured to the left, and if you go over there, you can look in people's backyards and see remnants of the reinforced wall and the tunnel that's literally underneath the city. And if you look on an aerial view, this particular feat was no easy task. It drills down and goes down, and then there's this tunnel that was quarried out of the stone from two directions, and they meet in between. It goes all the way out to the Siloam pool, which is your continuous, ongoing, safe drinking water source if you are exiled. So Jerusalem would have been in pretty good shape for a long period of time, at least as long as they have that fresh water. Of course, food was the other threat as well. But what's interesting is we have what's called a Siloam inscription, and you can read that for yourself, but it basically was etched into the side of the Siloam tunnel walls to commemorate, kind of like the Transcontinental Railroad meeting at the halfway point for the first time on the day. You've got two teams of builders, or in this case, stonemasons, who meet halfway through, and it commemorates the event. And that's what we have on the Siloam Tunnel. We found that. So just little things like that we have from archaeology support the reliability of God's word. So the Babylonian Empire is on the decline, and the next big bully on the block is the Persians, who began to rise in power as well. So we'll see that this is going to be the next post-exilic time period. So after the precipitating event, we'll look at it next week as well. But the Cyrus decree is going to be the precipitating event in 538 BC that allows 22,000 plus come back in about 3 waves under the leadership of Zerubbabel, wave 1, Ezra, wave 2, and Nehemiah, wave 3. They're going to come back and be responsible for the rebuilding of the temple, Israel's spiritual life, and then the walls to protect the people on the outside. So that's going to wrap up 1st and 2nd Kings.